Story 1: The Faceless Man. Imagine standing alone in an endless forest, where silence presses against you like a second skin. Then, through the trees, you see him, a man with no face. This is how my nightmare began. Idaho's wilderness is a world unto itself, vast, quiet, and untouched. It's the kind of place where the chaos of modern life disappears, leaving only the humbling presence of nature. I'd been drawn to it for years, fantasizing about escaping the relentless noise of the city. When I finally carved out time for myself, I chose an isolated trail that had been recommended on an outdoor enthusiasts forum. The post described it as pure solitude, unmarked on most maps and rarely traveled. That was exactly what I wanted: no crowds, no distractions, just miles of trees and silence. The drive out was uneventful, though the road became increasingly narrow as I neared the trailhead. It wound through dense pines, their branches closing in overhead, forming a natural tunnel. By the time I reached the gravel lot, it was late morning, and the sun cast long shadows across the forest floor. There wasn't a single other car in sight. That should have been a relief. I wanted isolation, after all, but instead, it made the forest feel daunting. Have you ever stood somewhere so quiet that it makes you feel small? That's how it felt the moment I stepped out of my car. I checked my gear: water, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, and enough supplies for 2 nights. My boots crunched against the dirt trail as I set off, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. The first hour was everything I had hoped for. The forest was serene, the air crisp and cool against my face. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in shifting patterns. Occasionally, a bird would call out or a squirrel would dart across the path. But for the most part, it was silent. Too silent. At first, I didn't notice. I was too caught up in the beauty of the place. The way the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. But as the hours wore on, the absence of sound became oppressive. I paused to sip some water, leaning against a tree and letting my gaze wander. That's when I first felt it, a strange heaviness in the air. Like the forest was holding its breath. It wasn't just quiet, it was still. Have you ever been in a place so silent that even your thoughts seemed too loud? That's how it felt as I stood there, the bottle halfway to my lips. I shrugged off the unease, chalking it up to being alone in such a vast space. But then, I saw him. It was subtle at first, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I wouldn't have noticed him if the light hadn't shifted, catching his silhouette against the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, though that seemed unlikely given how remote the trail was. But something about him was off. He didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out details. He was tall, his limbs unnaturally long, his posture stiff like a mannequin posed in a store window. His face, or where his face should have been, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just smooth, pale skin. My chest tightened as I stared, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Was it a mask? A prank? Hey! I called out, my voice loud and jarring in the stillness. He didn't respond. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The way light filters through branches can create strange illusions. After all, I blinked, and he was gone. Not gone as in he walked away. Gone, as if he had never been there at all. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he'd been. My heart pounded in my chest, and my fingers tightened around the straps of my pack. It had to be a trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe I was tired from the hike. Shaking off the unease, I forced myself to keep moving. But the joy I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. By late afternoon, the shadows stretched longer, and the temperature dropped. I found a small clearing off the trail and decided to set up camp before it got too dark. The routine was comforting. I pitched my tent, boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, and sat on a log, eating as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest transformed in the fading light, its edges blurring into shadow. When the stars emerged, the silence grew heavier. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch, sounded amplified. I tried to focus on the beauty of the night sky, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the figure I'd seen earlier. Had it been real? As I crawled into my tent, I triple-checked the zipper, making sure it was secured. I told myself it was just a precaution, but deep down, I wasn't convinced I was alone. I don't know how long I slept. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the cold. The air inside the tent was icy, biting against my face. Groggy, I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the dark. That's when I realized the tent door was open. Not unzipped partway, completely open. The flap hung limply, swaying slightly in the breeze. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, my heart hammering. Had I forgotten to close it? No. I was certain I had zipped it up tightly. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But the silence felt different now, oppressive. Like the forest was holding its breath. I zipped the door back up, my hands trembling, and sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the flashlight. Every noise outside made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. Morning came, but the unease didn't fade. I packed up camp quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind. The trail felt different now. The air was heavier. The trees seemed closer, their branches tangled like they were reaching for me. About an hour into my hike, I came across something on the trail that made my blood run cold. A bundle of sticks, bound tightly with rope, lay directly in my path. It was small, no larger than my forearm, but the sticks were twisted into a crude, human-like shape. I stared at it, my stomach churning. Someone had to have made this. I nudged it with my boot, half expecting it to crumble. But it held firm. The bindings were tight, deliberate. I kicked it into the underbrush and kept walking, my pace quickening. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now. An itch beneath my skin I couldn't ignore. By late afternoon, I'd had enough. My original plan to spend 2 nights in the wilderness was abandoned. I just wanted to get back to my car. The trail ahead curved through a dense section of forest, the shadows deepening with every step. And then, I saw him. He stood in the middle of the path, closer this time. His proportions were even more unnatural up close. His arms hung too low, his legs too long. His faceless head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered against my ribs. He didn't move. "Who are you?" I whispered. though my voice was barely audible. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted down the trail. My lungs burning and my legs aching. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the parking lot, I fumbled for my keys. My hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I backed out of the lot, I caught one last glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. He stood at the edge of the forest, his head tilted, his arms hanging unnaturally at his sides. I drove until I reached the nearest town, not daring to look in the mirror again. Even now, sitting in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window. What would you do if you saw him? Would you run? Or would you freeze? Let me know in the comments, and stay tuned for our next story. Dagger Ridge Trail. Story 2, Dagger Ridge Trail. They warned us about Dagger Ridge, a place that doesn't exist on maps but lives in the whispers of those who barely made it out. Eric thought it was just a legend. He was wrong. Some people can't resist a challenge. Eric was one of them. He was the type of person who thrived on adventure. The bigger the risk, the better the story. So, when he heard about Dagger Ridge from some half-baked podcast that specialized in urban legends, his excitement was immediate. "Ryan, you have to come with me," he'd said, practically buzzing with energy. "This place is insane, totally off the grid. It's not even on Google Maps." I'd heard the stories before. Dagger Ridge wasn't just some backwoods trail, it was a ghost story in its own right. Hikers spoke in hushed tones about the strange things they'd seen there: flickering lights, incomprehensible whispers, carvings on trees that seemed to appear and disappear overnight. And then there were the disappearances. "How do we even know it's real?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Eric grinned. "That's the point. We're going to find out." I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at me to back out. But Eric had this way of making his excitement contagious. Before I knew it, I'd agreed to a weekend hike into the most infamous trail in the region. "Great," Eric had said. "I promise. This is going to be epic." We arrived at the trailhead just past noon on Saturday. The drive had been uneventful. Winding roads lined with thick pines that grew denser the closer we got. The gravel parking lot was empty, save for a single weathered sign that read, "Unmarked Trail, Experienced Hikers Only." Doesn't get more inviting than that, Eric joked, slinging his pack over his shoulder. I tried to laugh, but the sight of that sign made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way the forest seemed to loom behind it. Darker and heavier than the trees we'd passed on the way in. "You ready?" Eric asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was convincing him or myself. The trail started wide, the dirt path cutting through rows of towering pines. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns. For the first hour, it felt like any other hike. Eric was his usual self, bounding ahead like a kid on Christmas morning. He pointed out birds, interesting plants, and even a squirrel that darted across the trail. "See," he said, turning back to me with a grin. "Nothing to worry about. Just nature being nature." I forced a smile. Yeah. Nothing creepy about a completely deserted trail in the middle of nowhere. Eric laughed, but his voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. The first carving we saw was subtle, etched into the trunk of a tree just off the trail. At first, I thought it was a natural mark. The kind left by animals sharpening their claws. But as we got closer, the pattern became clear. It was a spiral. Perfectly symmetrical. Its lines jagged and deep. Probably just some bored hiker. Eric said, running his fingers over the grooves. I frowned. It looks too precise. He shrugged and kept walking. But my eyes lingered on the carving. There was something unsettling about it. The way it seemed to pulse faintly in the dappled light. As we continued, more carvings appeared. Some were simple, spirals and intersecting lines, while others were far more intricate. One looked like a series of runes. Their jagged lines forming a pattern I couldn't decipher. Okay. I'll admit, Eric said, stopping to examine a particularly elaborate carving. This is a little weird. I crossed my arms. You think? Relax. It's probably some local trying to scare people off. You know how these small towns love their ghost stories. Or it's a warning. I muttered under my breath. Eric didn't hear me. He was already moving ahead. His flashlight in hand despite the fact that the sun was still high in the sky. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The trail narrowed. The trees growing closer together until their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here. Damp and heavy. Carrying a faint, sour smell that made me wrinkle my nose. You smell that? I asked. My voice barely above a whisper. Eric paused, sniffing the air. Yeah. Probably a dead animal or something. I wasn't convinced. The smell was faint but pervasive. A mix of rotting vegetation and something metallic. As we climbed higher, the forest grew eerily quiet. The birds that had chirped earlier were gone. And even the rustle of leaves seemed muted. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching against the dirt and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the breeze. Ever hear of the zone of silence? Eric asked suddenly, breaking the stillness. I glanced at him. What are you talking about? It's this place in Mexico where radio signals don't work. And everything goes quiet. People say weird stuff happens there. Kinda feels like that here. Don't you think? I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't want to think about it. We reached Silver Basin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The clearing was wide, framed by jagged cliffs that seemed to lean inward, casting long shadows across the grass. This is perfect, Eric said, dropping his pack in the middle of the clearing. Look at that view. I didn't respond. The beauty of the cliffs was lost on me. All I could focus on was the oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on the clearing. Like the forest was holding its breath. Eric, as usual, was unfazed. He set up his tent with practiced ease, humming to himself as if we were on an ordinary camping trip. I'm gonna check out the ridge, he said after dinner, grabbing his flashlight. What? I stood up, already reaching for my own flashlight. You're just going to wander off? It's getting dark. I'll be back in 10 minutes, he said with a grin. Relax, Ryan. You worry too much. I watched him disappear into the trees, his flashlight beam bobbing ahead of him. The fire crackled softly as I sat alone, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Eric? I called out, my voice too small in the vast silence. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the path he'd taken. The beam cut through the darkness, but the trees beyond the firelight seemed to swallow it whole. "Eric!" I shouted again. Louder this time. A faint sound, a branch snapping, echoed from the woods. Relief surged through me. "About time," I muttered, stepping toward the noise. But it wasn't Eric. The path led deeper into the forest, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam weak against the suffocating darkness. Then I saw it, his backpack. It lay in the middle of the trail, the straps torn and the fabric smeared with dirt. I crouched down, my heart pounding, and unzipped it. Inside, everything was intact: his water bottle, his flashlight, even the crumpled map he always carried. "Eric?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The beam of my flashlight caught something up ahead, a massive tree, its trunk etched with glowing symbols. The pattern seemed to pulse faintly, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. And then I heard it, the whisper. It was soft at first, like the wind through the trees. But it grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A figure stepped out from behind the tree. It was tall, impossibly thin, its movements jerky like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its face, or lack thereof, was a blank void, and its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. And then it took a step forward. My body finally obeyed. I turned and ran, tearing through the forest as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes, their roots grabbing at my feet. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hunting me. When I stumbled into the clearing where our camp had been, the fire was out. The tent was gone, scratched into the dirt. Glowing faintly in the moonlight were the same spiraling symbols I'd seen on the tree. They never found Eric. The search party combed the woods for days, but there was no trace of him, just his abandoned backpack and the strange carvings in the dirt. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but no one believed me. Now, years later, I still dream of that night. I see Eric in my nightmares, his body moving like a puppet, his face twisted into something that isn't a smile. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers. Would you go back to find out what happened? Or would you leave the mystery buried? Let me know in the comments, and stay tuned for the next story. The Watchers of the Pacific Northwest. Story 3, The Watchers of the Pacific Northwest. We thought the stories of the Forest Watchers were just folklore. But sometimes, legends are warnings, and ignoring them can be fatal. The Pacific Northwest has a way of getting under your skin. It's not just the endless expanse of towering pines or the mist that rolls in like ghostly fingers at dawn. It's something deeper, an ancient presence that seems to hum beneath the surface of the earth. Rick and I had always loved the outdoors. We'd spent countless weekends hiking and camping, chasing the kind of peace you can only find in places untouched by humanity. But this trip was different. Rick wasn't chasing peace. He was chasing a story. They call them the Forest Watchers, Rick had said, his eyes bright with excitement as we sat in my apartment, planning our route. They're supposed to be spirits, or maybe guardians, that live in the woods. Locals say they'll leave you alone as long as you don't disrespect the forest. And if you do? I'd asked. Rick had grinned. Then they'll notice you. I should have backed out right then. But Rick had always been the fearless one. The kind of person who laughed in the face of danger. And me? I was the guy who couldn't say no to a challenge. Even when every instinct told me to run the other way. The trip started like so many others, early morning coffee. A car packed with gear. And the promise of adventure hanging in the air. The drive was beautiful. The kind of scenery that makes you forget the world outside the forest even exists. The first sign that something was off came when we stopped for supplies at a gas station on the edge of the woods. The cashier was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes. She barely glanced at us as we grabbed snacks and bottled water. But when Rick mentioned the forest watchers, her head snapped up so fast it made me flinch. "You don't want to go looking for them," she said. Her voice low and urgent. Rick laughed. "Why not? Afraid they'll get us?" Her expression darkened. "Some stories aren't meant to be tested." She leaned closer. Her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't say their name. Don't taunt them. And whatever you do, don't stay in the woods after dark." Rick paid for our things and left without another word. I lingered for a moment, torn between curiosity and unease. "Do you really think they're out there?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just looked past me, toward the forest. Her face pale and drawn. The cabin was exactly as advertised, isolated, rustic, and tucked deep into the heart of the woods. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. At first glance, it was almost charming. The kind of place you'd expect to see in an old photograph, with its wooden beams and stone chimney. But as we got closer, the charm faded. The wood was weathered and cracked, the windows covered in a thin layer of grime. The front steps creaked ominously under our weight, and the air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew and damp earth. Rick didn't seem to mind. He tossed his bag onto the sagging couch and started exploring, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "This is perfect," he said, grinning. "Perfect for what?" I muttered, setting my bag down near the door. "Perfect for finding out if the stories are true." That evening, we sat by the fireplace, eating instant noodles and listening to the wind howl outside. The forest seemed to press against the walls of the cabin, its presence almost tangible. "You really think there's something out there?" I asked, breaking the silence. Rick shrugged. "I don't know. But don't you think it's worth finding out? I mean, what if the watchers are real? What if there's something out here that's been watching over these woods for centuries? Or something that's been hunting in them?" I muttered. Rick laughed. But it was a nervous laugh, the kind that doesn't quite reach your eyes. The air in the cabin felt colder as the night went on, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was just outside, watching us through the grimy windows. "Do you hear that?" Rick asked suddenly, his head tilted as if listening for something. I frowned. "Hear what?" "That humming. It's faint, but it's there." I strained to listen. And sure enough, there it was, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from the forest itself. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. Rick leaned back in his chair, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "You think they're watching us right now?" "Don't," I started. But he cut me off. "The forest watchers," he said, his voice exaggeratedly dramatic. "Come and get me." The moment the words left his mouth, the fire flickered violently, and a chill swept through the room. Rick. Stop. I snapped. My voice sharper than I intended. He laughed it off. But there was a nervous edge to it. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was a dream. But the longer I listened, the more distinct they became. They were soft, overlapping voices, their tones melodic yet unsettling. I sat up, my heart pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. And the whispers seemed to be coming from outside. Rick was awake too, sitting on the edge of the couch, his flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. You hear it too? I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then they were joined by another sound, footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly from one end of the cabin to the other. What the hell is that? Rick whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, too scared to speak. The footsteps stopped. And for a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a loud thud, something slammed against the roof. Pack your stuff, Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're leaving. We threw our things into our bags and ran to the car, our breaths visible in the icy air. The forest was darker than I'd ever seen, the trees looming like silent sentinels. As Rick started the car, I glanced back at the cabin. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, a tall, thin shadow that disappeared as soon as I blinked. The drive down the narrow road was tense. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw them, headlights. Rick. Someone's behind us, I said, my voice shaking. He glanced in the mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They weren't there a second ago. The car behind us sped up, its lights growing brighter and closer. Just as they were about to reach us, they disappeared. As we rounded a bend, Rick slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. Standing in the middle of the road was a stag. It was massive, its antlers stretching so high they seemed to scrape the sky. Its eyes glinted in the light, reflecting an unnatural, almost metallic glow. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the car with their eerie, mocking tones. The stag stared at us for what felt like an eternity, then slowly stepped aside, its movements deliberate and almost human. Rick didn't wait. He hit the gas, and we sped past the animal, its eyes following us as we disappeared down the road. We didn't stop until we saw the faint glow of a gas station sign. The lot was deserted, the lights flickering faintly as we pulled in. Rick got out to pump gas while I went inside to grab coffee. The air inside was heavy, and the cashier didn't look up as I approached the counter. Then I saw him. A man stood at the back of the store, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, he just stared at me with eyes that weren't human. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Rick appeared beside me, grabbing my arm. We need to go, he said, his voice tight. We left without another word. As we drove away, the whispers faded, but the sense of being watched never left. Rick admitted later that he'd felt it the entire time, a presence in the woods, something waiting for him to make a mistake. I think they let us go, he said quietly. I nodded. unable to shake the feeling that we'd been spared. But for how long? Would you have stayed in that cabin after hearing the whispers? Or would you have run? Let me know in the comments, and don't miss our next story. Vermont's malevolent woods. Sometimes the forest doesn't just watch, it takes. Story 4, Vermont's malevolent woods. The Vermont backwoods were supposed to be my escape. I didn't realize I was walking straight into a nightmare. Sometimes the world becomes too loud. I'd been drowning in the endless noise of city life, honking cars, buzzing phones, conversations that felt too shallow, deadlines that loomed too large. I craved an escape, a reprieve from the chaos. The Vermont backwoods seemed like the perfect solution. I'd heard about its beauty in passing conversations, untouched forests stretching for miles, where the air smelled like pine and the silence was so complete it pressed against your ears. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The decision to go was impulsive. I packed in a hurry, tossing a sleeping bag, flashlight, and a few granola bars into my backpack. I didn't bother with a detailed plan or even check the weather. All I wanted was to get away. As I drove deeper into Vermont, the cityscape gave way to rolling hills, then dense woods that lined the narrow roads like towering sentinels. The further I went, the quieter the world became. It was calming at first, peaceful. But as the miles passed, the quiet began to feel off. The air inside the car felt heavier, like I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, attributing it to my imagination. When I reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. It was empty, save for my car. That should have made me nervous. But at the time, it felt like a blessing. I grabbed my gear, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the trail. The trail began wide and well-trodden, its edges lined with moss and wildflowers. The trees stood tall and straight, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden patches. For the first mile or so, I felt at ease. The rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional chirp of birds, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze reminded me why I'd come. The forest had a timeless beauty, like it hadn't changed in centuries. But then, gradually, the atmosphere shifted. The trail narrowed, the underbrush growing thicker and darker. The air felt colder, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The birdsong stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my footsteps. And then even that seemed too loud. I paused, scanning the trees. The forest around me was still, too still. The kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, like the world is holding its breath. I shook off the unease and kept walking. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The first whisper came just as the sun slipped below the horizon. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to drift through the trees. I stopped, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't birds. It sounded like voices. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No response. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I continued down the trail, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words. Exactly, more like a murmur of overlapping tones. Too faint to make out but impossible to ignore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I'd stop, shining my flashlight into the trees. But there was nothing there. "You're just paranoid," I muttered under my breath. But the whispers didn't stop. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods. The further I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees were different here, gnarled and twisted. Their bark blackened as if scorched by fire. The air was thick and heavy, each breath feeling like it had weight. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam flickering as if the batteries were dying. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching loudly against the dirt. And then, I heard it. A scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was high-pitched and distorted. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It tore through the silence, freezing me in place. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The forest didn't answer. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. Too fast to be a person. I swung my flashlight toward it, my breath hitching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure hunched and twisted, its limbs moving unnaturally. Then it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, my legs moved on their own, carrying me forward in a daze. The whispers were louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, I saw it, a clearing. The moonlight illuminated the space, revealing something that made my stomach drop. In the center of the clearing was a circle of branches, arranged with eerie precision. They were tied together with strips of fabric, the knots so tight they looked unnatural. The ground inside the circle was bare, the dirt freshly disturbed as if something had been buried, or unearthed. Around the edges of the clearing, symbols were etched into the bark of the surrounding trees. They glowed faintly, their jagged lines forming patterns that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw them, footprints. The footprints were bare, human-like, but wrong. The toes were too long, the heels too narrow, and the stride was unnaturally wide. They led away from the circle, disappearing into the shadows beyond the trees. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of mocking voices that seemed to surround me. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I felt it, a presence. When the light returned, I saw it. A figure emerged from the tree line, its body contorted in ways that defied logic, its arms and legs bent at unnatural angles, its movements jerky and inhuman. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a blank void, the skin smooth and pale like polished stone. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and took a step forward. I turned and ran, my legs moving before my brain could process what I'd seen. The trail was a blur, my flashlight swinging wildly as I sprinted through the darkness. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, until they seemed to be inside my head. Branches clawed at my arms, and roots threatened to trip me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally stumbled into the parking lot, I nearly collapsed with relief. My car was still there, parked in the same spot I'd left it. But as I reached for the door handle, I saw it, a muddy handprint smeared across the driver's side window. It was too large to be human, the fingers too long and thin. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, threw my pack into the back seat, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed beneath the tires as I sped out of the lot, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers faded as I left the forest behind, but the sense of being watched never did. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of that night. At home, when the house is quiet, I hear faint whispers outside my window. They're so soft I could almost convince myself they're not real. But I know better. Sometimes, I catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that disappears as soon as I turn my head. And at night, when I close my eyes, I see the figure standing in the clearing, its blank face tilted as if it's still watching me. The Vermont backwoods were supposed to be my escape. Instead, they became my nightmare. Would you have kept walking after hearing those whispers? Or would you have turned back at the first sign of something strange? Let me know in the comments, and remember, some places aren't meant to be explored. These 4 stories show us that the unknown is both terrifying and irresistible. Whether it's the faceless man, the haunted trails, the watchers of the Pacific Northwest, or Vermont's malevolent woods, one thing is clear: some mysteries are better left unsolved. Which story left you with chills? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your own tales of the strange and unsettling. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tales for more terrifying journeys into the unknown. Remember, stay curious, but always stay cautious. The forest doesn't always let you leave.